what we call the Black Liberation Army, really is a concept more than an organization, but more of a concept. And that evolves maybe into an organization, but it starts out as a movement concept. The first time as a historian I see the term being used is in, I believe it's in mid-60s, the Revolutionary Action Movement. There was a document that they had that talked about organizing black youth into a Black Liberation Army. The Revolutionary Action Movement was formed in the early 1960s. It was a radical organization. It always portrayed itself as a clandestine organization, a secretive organization. It starts in the Midwest, in Cleveland, with college students and some people who come out of the left. Black people were part of the left, but want to incorporate some of the activism of the civil rights movement, but they also had more of a black nationalist orientation. They weren't integrationists per se. They said they saw themselves somewhere between SNCC and CORE on one level and the Nation of Islam on the other hand. They were influenced by left politics, but they wanted to be independent from the white left in the United States. So that was their political orientation. They saw themselves as revolutionary nationalists. So as they began to organize youth, and when you started to begin to have the urban rebellions in the 1960s, I think they have this whole concept of organizing black youth into a Black Liberation Army. So that was one element of this concept being promoted during that particular time. But I think many of people in the Black Liberation Movement, the Black Power movement, had this whole concept of having a black underground. Of course, when most of us think of the Black Liberation Army, we kind of associated with the Black Panther Party. And Black Panther Party in its program said that Black Panther Party members couldn't belong to any other military other than the Black Liberation Army. They never said this is our organization, but if you consider it being a concept in the Black Power movement at that particular time, and the Panthers being the largest Black Power organization, then, and particularly when Panthers are forced underground, that's the what they operationalize their underground into is this whole concept of, or under the name, under the umbrella of a Black Liberation Army at that particular time. But you got people who are influenced by RAM, you got people who are influenced by RNA, you got people, when I say RNA, I mean the Republic of New Africa and the Black Panther Party, who are all a part of this broad movement concept. And people who weren't part of any organization that was with the underground, being above ground at that particular time, the public movement. So it's this broad concept, and it becomes at different times more people began to use the name, operate under that name, and maybe even make statements under the name of a Black Liberation Army. Well, it's been a strategic maneuver since we got here. If you look at the first black folks who came to the United States, they always tell us 1619, but the first actually were brought to what we call North America in 1526, were brought to what we now call Georgia, McIntosh County, were brought by the Spanish, and they ended up harassed. The reason we don't know about that community, or the Spanish aren't in Georgia anymore, is because the African people got together with the Native Americans and ran the white folks off. They waged guerrilla warfare at that particular time. And if you look at the slave revolts, whether it be Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, this is why if you saw some of the BLA documents, they say the BLA goes back to slavery. Goes back to Nat Turner, the Denmark Vesey, to Gabriel Prosser, that goes back to the Seminoles, Seminole freedmen who fought guerrilla warfare. So there's always been black people who imagined that we needed to pick up arms and fight against our oppressors. Even today, people might not talk about it, but in our imagination, in our own minds, there's a hope that, when we see our people being brutalized by the police and terrorized in our particular communities, there are black people who think, well, we need somebody to respond to that. Who can we call upon? And so I think that's something that black folks tend to identify with somebody who's going to fight in their interests and bring justice in our situation, particularly when we don't see the criminal justice system in this society bringing justice on our behalf. So it's been something that's always been imagined. You mentioned 1969 as being a hot year. It's not the start, but it's a hot year, a very intense year. Some people call that year the year of the Panther, and not because the Panthers were so vibrant on one level, but also because, in 1969, but also during that period of time, you had such a vicious assault on the Black Panther Party by local police forces, by the FBI, culminating in that year with the murder of Fred Hampton in Chicago, and also the raid on the Los Angeles Panther chapter in Los Angeles, California. So when you have those attacks, and particularly in Los Angeles with them, many Panthers viewing the attack on the Panther office in Central Avenue in Southern California, it was like an all-out assault by the LAPD. That was the first time SWAT was being used in Los Angeles. They were attacked in a pre-dawn raid, and you basically had teenagers being able to successfully defend the office from this all-out assault by LAPD. So many in the Panther Party at that time, even though you had 13 Panthers arrested, many viewed that as a victory. But it kind of signaled at that particular moment that the Panthers were under attack. And you start to see series of cases, whether they be minor, little misdemeanor cases to major felony cases, being trumped up against the Panthers at that particular time. The government basically had the strategy of just trying to tie the party up in a series of trials where they would sap their resources. Okay, but also methods or things were used to try to incarcerate people for long periods of time. If they could manufacture evidence, if they could force people who might have had charges against them to give testimony that would convict other Panthers. But a series of repressive measures were done, and so many people didn't feel it was good for them to hang around and end up in prison, and they decided it was best, rather than being available, and some of them actually had charges against them, to not be available and to continue to fight in an underground level. And I think the perception they had at that particular time was that, there was, not only was the Panthers under attack, but genocide was coming to black people, and so it was necessary to have an arm that could respond to the genocide that was being waged on black people. I think it's a lot of people don't look at it from this perspective today, but actually a low-intensity war was being waged against the Black Panther Party to root them out of the black community at that particular time. And so they responded in kind. If a war was being waged upon them, then they were going to be at war. And they were going to, so the Black Panther Party and many other elements of Black Liberation Movement went underground and formed clandestine units, secretive units, to be able to respond to the attacks being waged on black people at that particular time. That it was a hostile situation, that there was again a low-intensity war being waged on the Black Liberation Movement at that particular time, what people popularly call COINTELPRO, but that was just the FBI's program. The CIA had a program, Army Intelligence had a program, Naval Intelligence had a program, local police forces had a program to try to destroy the Black Liberation Movement at that time. And not just folk we call radical, but even people like Dr. King, were being, targeted by the United States government at that particular time. Dr. King was viewed by the FBI as being a communist and a threat to U.S. security. It's similar to it would be like them saying that Martin Luther King was a terrorist today, under the George Bush's war on terrorism. So you had this assault on the movement at that particular time, and basically not under U.S. domestic law, but under even international law. and many people were kind of proponents of people studied Malcolm X, and Malcolm X told folk to look at what was going on around the world. And as they looked around the world, people around the world were fighting for their freedom against colonialism and racism and all other forms of repression, whether it being in Vietnam during that particular time, or whether it being in Africa where you had African liberation movements fighting against colonialism, things of that nature. So I think folks were inspired by those movements, and they knew by international law they basically had a right to utilize any means that were available to them to fight for their liberation. I think that was a movement and a ideological current that was going on at that particular time to kind of influence people, that they had any means available to them to be able to respond to this assault that was occurring on our movements. I mean, if you talk about people who were organizing breakfast programs, free health clinics, and things of that nature in the black community at that particular time, and they were trying to destroy that, then they felt they had to respond in kind, And so it was a hostile situation, and they were under attack, and so they chose to do what they thought was right, particularly by international law and by people's moral standards. That if you're under attack, you have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to utilize any means to stop people from killing you. Their political acts. That was their motivation, were political motivation. Their motivations weren't to get rich or die trying, like 50 Cent says today. No, they were trying to free their people, and they were trying to protect themselves. Their motivations were political, and they were motivated by political acts and political. What we call it? If you take somebody who decides, I'm gonna leave college, I have a promising career as a upwardly mobile black professional, but I see people dying in the street, I see poverty in the black community, and I want to change these conditions, so I'm gonna leave college and I'm gonna become a part of this movement, okay, to change the conditions in my community. Okay, that's not somebody who's a criminal who's saying, look, I just want to get rich, okay, I just want power for myself. No, these young people at that time, because we're talking about young people, they decided to go underground because they wanted to change what they saw as a racist, oppressive society. I mean, and keep in mind, all of these young people were part of things like the Black Liberation Army, Black Panther Party, Republic of New Africa, and these type of organizations. They grown up seeing Emmett Till lying in a casket, disfigured from being lynched. Emmett Till was probably around the age of most of the people when these organizations are maybe a little bit older. They grew up seeing black folks being water holes for just trying to get basic civil and human rights. They saw people denied entrance to colleges and things of that nature. So they grew up with this perspective. They grew up in communities where to be black and poor were damn near synonymous. They grew up in communities where police just terrorized our communities. And so they wanted to change that. That was their motivation. Their motivation wasn't to be in a penthouse and drive a stretch limo, So you really can't define their acts as criminal. You can only define them as motivated by human rights and political change, political social change, and social justice. Well, we'll say from the 69 up until the mid-70s, okay, because 69, as I said, when you have the repression, particularly on the Black Panther Party and other Black Power movement organizations, you have several people forced to go underground, okay, and if you look at the Black Liberation Army of that period, and I'm basing this upon, police reports, trials, and even BLA documents where they claim certain activities. Okay, but if you look at that particular period, most of the activity is, number one, defensive, because people are trying to evade being attacked. But you also have, particularly in the New York region at that particular time, you had several incidents where children were being killed by cops, and there was no redress. Oftentimes they were declared justifiable homicides. And so you have forces who felt they need to respond to those actions against police in terms of murdering black children and black people in black communities at that particular time. So you have these responses to the police on one level. You also have post-Vietnam, you have the influx of drugs in the black community at that particular time. And so you have actions on part of people in the black movement at that particular time. And they got to be underground, right, to respond to drugs being filtered in the black community at that particular time, particularly heroin. And so you have expropriations, if you will, from drug dealers at that particular time, and military attacks on drug dealers in the black community at that particular time. That kind of characterizes the activity at that particular time. You also have expropriations from the mid to late 70s. You have some underground expropriations beginning to occur, and I think, you know, looking at it from a historical perspective, I think what's going on is because you also have like the acceleration, and a lot of people don't really think about this, but you had the acceleration of a paramilitary right in this country in the late 70s, and you got folks like David Duke beginning to speak and run for offices and win a significant amount of votes. You have Tom Mesker in California, who again runs for office and wins a significant amount of votes. But you also have like these paramilitary groups in Louisiana and Alabama and North Carolina who talk about they're organizing for a right-wing revolution in this country, a white supremacist revolution in this country. In the Northwest, you have the Aryan Nations movement that's cropping up at that particular time in the late 60s, late 70s, early 80s. You have there were actually a segment of the Klan who attempted to organize a coup of the country of Dominica. They were first contracted by the United States government to be involved in mercenary activity in Grenada. So it was that was even a signal that there was some collaboration between some elements of the United States government and these white supremacist elements. So you had clandestine forces. We know this from communiques that were put out from the Black Liberation Army at that particular time, that they were trying to arm themselves and organize themselves to respond to this, what they considered to be a massive attack on the black community. So you begin to see these expropriations, if you will, from American financial institutions to begin to create this infrastructure to be able to respond to this attack that was going to occur. They saw it was going to occur on black people at that particular time. So that's what kind of characterizes that period. And of course, you have the trials, the RICO conspiracy trials and things that kind of resulted from that activity during that particular time. But Kamal Siddiqui's case, Kamal was actually arrested on a domestic dispute in New York City. And I believe it was like in maybe 2001, 2002. I can't remember the particular year. Being that he was a former member of the Black Panther Party, and he's also the father of the child of Assata Shakur, the FBI come in to interview him, and basically he's given an offer to provide, if he provides information on Assata's escape from prison in 1979, if he also explains how she got to Cuba, and if he's able to cooperate by enticing Assata to go to a third country where they could come in and snatch her up, then they would make sure he was released. If not, they said he would die in prison because Kamal had sarcoidosis of the liver, he had hepatitis, high blood pressure, and you know, he wasn't the most healthy individual. he refused to cooperate with them. And so at that time, the FBI convinced the state of Georgia to reopen a case that they had closed. Georgia had stated in the 70s that the people who had murdered a cop here in Georgia, I forgot his name, in the 1970s, they said the case was closed when 2 BLA members were killed in the United States. They suspected Twyman Myers and I think Frank Fields to be the people who actually killed a police officer. But Georgia was convinced to reopen the case and to make Kamal Siddiqui a suspect. Kamal was indicted, then brought to Georgia and convicted, and he's now doing time in Augusta Medical Center here in the state of Georgia. But I think that, to me, that was a key case to kind of reopen, because you began to hear after the Kamal Siddiqui case, grand juries starting in other states, in California and New York, investigating things that occurred in the 70s with quote-unquote Black Liberation Army related cases. So the most notable one is the case of the San Francisco 8, where 8 individuals are being charged with the murder of a police officer, or the killing of a police officer, killing of a police officer in San Francisco, California, when there was a raid on a police office at that particular time, a police department office at that particular time. There's in this case is very interesting insofar as the San Francisco 8 case. The most of the case is based upon torture of some Panthers that occurred in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1973, and that evidence and that testimony was thrown out since it was proven at that particular time that Panthers were tortured over a period of weeks. And after that torture, they decided to just say anything that at that time, I think it was not only the FBI, but it was the New York police were involved in torture, San Francisco police and New Orleans police. And so since they weren't able to get into that they weren't able to be able to use that evidence at that time, now they're claiming that they have new evidence, even though it hasn't even been proven yet that they actually have new evidence. First they claimed they had physical evidence. They don't have, but now they don't have any physical evidence. They claimed that they had the gun that was used at that time, but now all of a sudden they don't have the gun. But they have these 8 men being held. Most of them are on bail at this particular time, and 2 of them who are already incarcerated are being held in San Francisco, based upon the fact that they have no evidence really. But what some of us actually believe is with the kind of the agenda that you have with the Bush administration. There are elements in the government that were actually going back and they're trying to resolve old conflicts that they haven't forgotten, and there's no spirit of consideration of reconciliation. They're just going back and targeting folks. And I think this is in the same spirit is why you have folks like Mutulu Shakur, Jamil Alameen, and Sekou Odinga transferred from prisons in different parts of the country. Jamil Alameen even being a state prisoner and taking the Florence ADX, the highest security prison in the United States, for no reason at all other than political reasons, that they want to have these men there because they're potentially leaders. And again, the people in this government are trying to carry out old grudges, and so these men are basically locked away, isolated from their families and friends. They're thousands of miles away from any particular family member, and limited contact or visits, kept under 23-hour lockdown, and the hour they get is in isolation also, because you don't have any contact with any other prisoner. It's a way not only to punish them or as payback or revenge for their activism in the past and their fight for social justice in the past, but it's also a means to try to disorient them and try to destroy them as potential leaders in our community. Well, originally we talked about how you had this period from the 1971 through 75, which was a period where people were forced underground, and you had folks responding to like police terror around the country, and you had people responding to the influx of drugs in the community. So it was like a Stop the Pusha campaign. I know some forces, I know we used to call it Damn the Pusha Man campaign. It was like a campaign against dope in our community, okay, particularly heroin at that particular moment. But then in the mid-70s, I'm sorry, all the way to the early 80s, you had units that were participating in expropriations to prepare themselves for what they saw as a right-wing white supremacist onslaught on the black community, a genocidal attack on the black community. In this period, you have really from in the late 90s through the current period of time, you've had these attacks on who the government perceived was a part of the black underground, or who they try to label as being part of the black underground. So you have, for instance, the case of Kamal Siddiqui, and you have the cases of the San Francisco 8, and who knows what others. We know that there was also a grand jury in New York investigating things that occurred in the 1970s in the New York area. But that's what's kind of characterized this period. But you can also, I would also include in that, though, as we mentioned earlier, the attack really on political prisoners by putting people like Batulu Shakur, Jamil Alameen, and Sekou Odinga in the Supermax prison in Florence ADX. The raising the bounty of Assata Shakur to $1.5 million. It's been particularly with this administration, the Bush administration, has targeted like these elements who are like symbols of resistance to black people, and to try to further repress them. And I think in the case of the people who are in Florence ADX, to really try to destroy them mentally by placing them in these conditions where they're in a 23-hour lockdown, and little contact, through using the phones or limiting their visitations, things of that nature, to try to destroy them psychologically. So I think this kind of characterizes an attack on the black movement, and that's how it has to be seen. There is a form of counterinsurgency called developing what they call pseudo gangs. The first time it's really documented is in the Mau Mau, or the Kenyan nationalist movement against British colonialism. One of the things the British did was create recruit Africans to do activities for them. We know that happened in the Black Liberation Movement in DC and other places. They created black organizations. They even created Klan chapters and did to do things. So that's possible. I haven't seen any evidence for it, let me put it that way, that I can confirm and speak on definitively. But that is a part of counterinsurgency strategy to do that, and they will do it. Some people say that the Black Liberation Army was premature. Again, I think when you talk about most of the actions that we talked about in the past, people were forced into that activity. People were involved in organizing for a plebiscite peacefully, right? People were involved in breakfast programs. People were involved in trying to provide health care for our people, and things of that nature. And they were attacked and forced underground. They responded to defend themselves and try to survive as human beings, and also to carry out activity when they were under war. If you compare that to other situations, just like people in France were attacked by the Nazis, right? And they formed resistance to fight back. I mean, that's what people do when they're under such an assault. They go underground and try to survive, and oftentimes wage guerrilla warfare or whatever to try to survive. So I wouldn't say it was premature. If anything, that would be saying the whole movement was premature. but they were attacked and they responded, and what they could do, being young folks at that time, you know, you're talking about, again, we're talking about people who were teenagers in their early 20s. You had some folks who were Vietnam vets and had military skills, but again, they were kind of forced underground and responded, and if anything, they developed a capacity to respond over time. But I wouldn't say it was premature. I would say they did the best they could. Well, I think because of COINTELPRO, I think there was a division in the ranks of the Black Liberation Movement at that time. So because of divisions within the movement, oftentimes when you had comrades who were attacked, who were part of the underground, they wouldn't receive support from certain forces who were above ground because of ideological differences, which I think were magnified by by the elements of the state, and because of the immaturity of the movement. Again, we're talking about young people. We're not talking about people with a leadership that's been seasoned over decades of struggle, right? And so because of that, you had these divisions in the movement, and from my perception, you didn't get support for folk when they were underground during that particular time. I also believe that the movement's resources were also kind of stretched because, again, when we talked about earlier in terms of COINTELPRO attacking the Black Panther Party and other organizations and tying them up with a series of felonies and cases, a lot of resources were used on legal defense during that particular time. So when some people were arrested, you didn't have the capacity to support them. I think also the state was kind of effective at labeling people as, you know, crazy cop killers or whatever during that particular time, and so maybe it was some fear associated by some of the people in civil liberty organizations and other organizations in terms of providing support for people who have been engaged in armed struggle. So, you know, they didn't get adequate support, but there were small groups of supporters who valiantly fought, who attended trials, who got lawyers together, things of that nature. And, you know, we don't want to forget the activity of people who are engaged in that type of activity. One of the things of note was Mutulu Shakur and Afeni Shakur were part of an effort called the National Task Force for COINTELPRO Litigation and Research. And through that activity, they were able to help the defense of people like Geronimo Jijaga, Dharuba Ben Wahad, and others who were in prison, but they kind of proved that there was this whole governmental strategy to set these people up and put them and incarcerate them. So we can't forget those type of efforts that people waged in the community at that time, in spite of all the COINTELPRO attacks continuing, and in spite of the lack of resources, people still maintain a fight to try to free some of these political prisoners and prisoners of war. I think the thing I think that's most important about the Black Liberation Army and that experience is, you know, oftentimes I think, do we want future generations to look back and to say we didn't do anything? Like when I think about a Nat Turner, when I think about a Denmark Vesey, as a professor, when I talk to my classes, when I point out the resistance that our people engaged in, whether it was black people who escaped and worked with the Seminole Indians in resistance, or the black people who were in the Great Dismal Swamps and who resisted during that time, or Harriet Tubman. These are examples that we weren't happy during slavery. These were examples that people did fight back. When we look at the Civil Rights Movement, you know, it's examples. The Fannie Lou Hamers and others. And I think the Black Liberation Army represents that. The fact that somebody was even capable of liberating Assata Shakur out of the penitentiary, and now she lives as a maroon, basically, or I like to say Quilombo, in Cuba. That showed that there were some people who were dedicated and sophisticated and willing to sacrifice themselves for the overall freedom of our people. So I think that's what they most represent. They represent a continuation of this legacy of people who desire to fight and struggle. You have one part of the Weather Underground, and of course, there's all this controversy over Bill Ayers and Barack Obama right now. But they were valiant resistance fighters, but they were allowed to rehabilitate themselves. Looking at a Bill Ayers, who's now up until this attack by the right wing and John McCain and those, was a respectable part of the Chicago political scene. But you have a person like that, but then you have BLA members who they're not even seriously considered for parole. And why aren't they seriously considered for parole? Say the case of Sundiata Acoli, where it's mentioned by his parole board because of his belief in independence for New African people, because of his belief that we have a right to a nation and self-determination. He's denied parole. It's a very clear case of political internment. His continued existence in the penitentiary is political internment. He's clearly a political prisoner for that reason. So there is a difference in terms of how the BLA, how other, even Native American fighters like Leonard Peltier and others, this country is not seeing, this empire, I should say, is not seeking reconciliation with them. And this is why Mutulu Shakur and others have said we need to have a campaign for truth and justice around that period, to talk about what occurred and to hold the United States accountable for things that happened during that period of time, but also to bring about some justice for those who are in prison because of this hostility that existed within the United States at that particular time. And it's important that people don't forget, and that we have to raise their names up. In other words, like places like the Million Man March, the political prisoners have to be acknowledged. There's no serious people who ever fight for the liberation of their folks. In South Africa, when they were fighting against apartheid, they talked about the people the soldiers who were incarcerated, right? When you talk about the Irish movement, they talked about their soldiers who were incarcerated. When you look at the Middle East, the Palestinians, one of their most primary demands is the release of people who've been interned in the West Bank and Gaza, right? So until we place that as a priority in our movement, we won't have a serious freedom or liberation movement in this country. Because there are white people like Marilyn Buck, who's still incarcerated today because of her affiliation with the underground movement. You even have Silvio Berardini, who lives now free in Italy, but it was a political prisoner who was associated with the movement, and the black underground in this country, which is why she was incarcerated. I kind of see those folks as like descendants of like John Brown, whites who participated in underground railroad during that particular time. But if you talk about the general white left at that particular time, really kind of isolated. It wasn't just the BLA, because you can't even look at the BLA in isolation, but it was the revolutionary black movement in this country oftentimes was seen as a threat to them. Even going back, you mentioned Robert Williams earlier. The Robert Williams who was talking about defending himself from the Klan in North Carolina when he was in exile in Cuba. Some of the left forces in this country attempted to isolate him while he was in Cuba and didn't want his message about self-defense to be projected on an international level or even projected in the United States from there. So it's always been racism in the left, and not a willingness to respect our right to self-determination. And the BLA represents an expression of that. The expression of black people who want to have some self-determination. It's the Black Liberation Army, fighting for black liberation, who was in alliance with, wanted to see, because BLA was not a exclusive organization, if you will. In other words, they saw themselves being in solidarity with liberation of people inside this country and around the world, no matter what ethnic group they were. So, but they were like, they would not be talked about, and there were certain places where if you were engaged in solidarity with that, they didn't want you to speak on the platform. If there were major rallies, they didn't want you to be represented to talk about these particular people. And so there was a sense of isolation that occurred by a section, which was the majority of the left inside the United States. There's not much of a left today, but I'm just saying they didn't want to talk about that. That in a lot of the cases, that was a strategy to put the state on trial, because people recognize, for instance, if you had a case of folk who were attempted to expropriate something from a drug dealer who was selling drugs in our community, right? People would try to expose the relationship of that drug dealer to the police and everything else, and the jury would a lot of times see that. And I think there was a couple of elements of a strategy of trying to put the state on trial, whether it was crooked cops, whether it was a system that was exploiting our people, or drug dealers, or things of that nature. I think I think they were trying to win the trial by exposing the jury to what was going on and politically educate the jury. But number two, in terms of educating the people who were not allowed in the courtroom, just to give them a political context of what was going on in America. Because I think ultimately, as revolutionaries, they believed that the biggest trial was waiting to happen. It wasn't just the trials that they were engaged in, even though they were trying to free their comrades. So, and I think it was an attempt to try to define their reality and using that arena to try to define our reality and who they were. That, again, they weren't criminals. They were, in fact, revolutionaries, or they were people fighting for self-determination. And so they wanted to define that. And, that's why some of the best statements, I think, about the Black Liberation Army are statements that were made in trial. If you would read the trial statement of Kwesi Balagoon, if you were to read the statements that were made in court by Sekou Odinga, or the court document that was used by Mutulu Shakur, the state even challenging the right of the United States government to try him, because Mutulu actually stated that this in this particular case, and what he was being charged with, he didn't say he was involved in the acts, but he said the acts he was charged with, for example, the liberation of Assata Shakur. He said, given the political context of that act, the United States government could not even try that in American courts. That it had to be tried by an international tribunal. It was interesting that other people have actually studied, I'm talking about other people who have been captured by the United States government, have studied Mutulu's document and used that in their legal cases, because he kind of set some precedent, and the judge in that case forced the Defense Department of the United States to respond to Mutulu's argument. He ultimately did not accept that particular motion, but I think it was, again, an attempt by the legal defense in that particular case to try to define exactly what's going on here. And that stands as a record, again, as a document that shows the intentionality of the people who engaged in that struggle during that particular time. And there was the development of, while folks were incarcerated, an attempt to try to consolidate, because as I mentioned before, you had it was what we call the Black Liberation Army, was something that's very decentralized, represented different elements of the movement. But when you had so many comrades who were incarcerated and behind walls, they did develop secretly a means of consolidating themselves and to play an impact in the broader movement. So, for instance, I remember being at a rally in 1979. It was 3 days after Assata was liberated, and then you had a statement from the Black Liberation Army coordinating committee that talked about the significance of what occurred. Because all we knew was we heard on the news that the sister broke out of jail, and all we had was her media accounts. So finally we got a statement from clandestine forces, from secret forces in our liberation movement, underground forces, of what was the significance of this event and who was responsible for it. So it's significant from that point of view. But let me also say that many comrades, whether it was under the direction of this coordinating committee or it was just as individuals, they became the leadership of men who were incarcerated in whatever prisons they were in. And I think they played major roles in preventing gang conflicts. They played a major role in helping to transform young men who had that criminal mentality. So they played a significant role in trying to change people. I've heard young men who talked about how they sold drugs from the time they were 11 years old till they were in their adulthood, and how they helped their families, their individual households. They didn't realize they were destroying the community until they came in contact with political prisoners who took the time to politically educate them and help transform them. They said that was the only rehabilitation that they saw, was from the interaction from these elder former Panthers, former BLA, former RNA, former RAM people who are incarcerated now, who did that for them. And it always makes me wonder what would be what would our communities be like today if you had a Sundiata Acoli on the street or Mutulu Shakur on the street. They were taken away from us. And again, when you see their capacity as organized as incarcerated, what would be their capacity to organize on the streets? And what condition would our community be in today had they not been taken from us in the first place? So it's a tremendous loss not having some of your most talented, creative, and intelligent organizers here with us today. Well, you've had, I think from the initiation of Black Liberation Army political prisoners, you've had several efforts to appeal to the international community and international bodies. One of the first ones I can remember is in 1977, I believe. You had a petition that was done with the National Council of Black Lawyers that had support of many Black Liberation Army political prisoners and prisoners of war. And from that, there was an investigation done and visit done to political prisoners around the United States by United Nations officials. Of course, throughout the late 70s and early 80s, you had efforts going to the United Nations to, from the Commission on Human Rights in Geneva. A lot of these efforts were led by the December 12th movement, and they petitioned and gave information to the international community about the state of political prisoners and prisoners of war inside the United States. Also in the 80s, you had a delegation go to Zimbabwe to represent Dr. Mutulu Shakur and trying to get political asylum for Dr. Mutulu Shakur in Zimbabwe during that particular time. But you've had several efforts that have been initiated by political prisoners themselves or people who work in their defense to educate the international community about the situation and reality of us having political prisoners and prisoners of war inside the United States, but also to get support and solidarity for their release or political asylum in foreign countries. I don't know. I don't think it, what Malcolm used to say, those who know don't say, and those who say don't know. When in a period of time that Asada was liberated in 79, see, when Asada was captured and convicted, New York papers came out and they said BLA is dead. There's no BLA. Then all of a sudden, she liberated. And then they, later on documented all this other activity that occurred. So I don't know of its existence, and I haven't, but I don't know, But what I would say is, there always has been, and there always will be a Black Liberation Army until our people free. And so I would say yes, but I don't know. I have no knowledge of it. I judge freedom myself that Black people would have the right to determine what their relationship is going to be with the United States, first and foremost. Then number two, that it would mean that people's basic needs can be achieved, whether it be food, clothing, shelter, quality education, health care, all of those things. Because I think at the core of our people, we basically think that those basics should be achieved. I think our people basically had them. When our people, before we were in North America, in the societies we lived in, we had food, we had clothing, we had shelter, we had our own forms of health care, right? And we don't have those things now. And so, but primarily when I talk about determine our relationship to the United States government, it means that we would be able to determine and use our resources in a way that we can achieve food, clothing, shelter, health care, all of those things that are basic, quality education. But right now, somebody else determines that for us, right? Somebody else decides in our communities what they utilize and determine with our resources, our taxes and things like that, what type of education we're going to get. Somebody determines with our resources what type of health care we can get. Somebody determines with our resources what food is available to us. What type of services are available for our basic lives. So until we have control of those resources and be able to determine those things, I would say we're not free. Well, I think we've been fighting for it. And that's what we're talking about today. That's what the Black Liberation Army has been fighting for. And that's what Nat Turner fought for. That's what them RVC fought for. That's what Harriet and them fought for. That's what the people who escaped and ran away to the Great Dismal Swamp. That's what they were fighting for. That's what Marcus Garvey wanted. You feel what I'm saying? That's what Malcolm X wanted. So that's what Queen Mother Moore wanted when she talked about reparations. So that's something that's been a historical fight. I think, and I don't think, I know I haven't given up on that fight. And I know that's what, when you think about Tulu Shakur being incarcerated, he ain't gave up that fight. When you think about Sundiata Acoli, he ain't gave up on that fight. That's why they won't parole him. If you think about, that's why Assata Shakur is in Cuba, right? And Sister Nahanda Biadoun and people like that. Folks haven't given up on that fight. What we have to do is increase our capacity, because I think the needs of our people are there, where we just need to have that vision again. Okay, so I don't look at our people and say our people are something wrong with us or anything of that nature. What I say is our people are fighting against, in this period, the most sophisticated empire that exists right now. And I think we've done a great job, and we've been involved in a great struggle and a great fight. But we just got to meet the challenge, and we'll get there. We will get there. There are a lot of people from our movement who are still incarcerated. There are a lot who are still exiled. I think that we should never forget them. As I said before, we can measure our progress by the fact we still have them incarcerated, and we still have folks who are exiled. I think also that it's important that projects like yours continues on, because we have to educate our youth to what our struggle was. And I think one of the most challenging things to me today is the people you're talking about from the 1960s and 70s. They had a great capacity to dream. and they had a significant belief that they could change the world. And this is something I don't think we're seeing in our children today. I think that's one of the reasons that prisons are full of black youth who are in prison for crimes. You know what I mean? Who are in prison for a whole lot of stuff. You know, I think if people had a vision and a feeling they could change the world like folks during that time, if they incarcerated us, it wouldn't be about that. It wouldn't be about, you know, us doing things to each other, but it'd be about us trying to change this world.